Lunchtime. My name's Donald Bryson. I'm the president of the John Locke Foundation, and thanks for tuning in to our latest presentation of the Civitas poll. Not many organizations do this in North Carolina that do regular polling of the state to keep their pulse on what's going on and what the opinions are of the citizens of North Carolina, and that's something that we're happy to do, something we brought over from the Civitas Institute when the Civitas Institute and the John Locke Foundation merged back on January 1st. We do 8 to 10 of these a year every year, and sometimes we'll do flash polls on specific issues. This is one of our regular statewide polls where we talk about a variety of issues, and we're happy that you joined us today. If you look at your screen, we'll talk a little bit about the poll, and then we'll get into figure out what is the climate in North Carolina? What is the political and policy climate in North Carolina right now? On our screen right now, you'll see that this poll was conducted by Signal Polling. That's a group, I think actually based out of Alabama, but they have satellite offices all around the country, including Pennsylvania and in Washington, D.C. This poll was conducted October 15th through 17th of 2021, so it's a very fresh poll just out of the field and included 600 likely 2022 general election voters here in North Carolina. That gives us a margin of error of plus or minus 4.0%. with a confidence interval of 95%, which means that if we conducted this poll 20 times, 19 out of those times we would find results within that 4.0% margin of error. People will always want to know about how we actually conducted the poll. These interviews were conducted via live phone calls, texting, SMS, and email invitations. They were weighted to reflect the likely 2022 general election voter universe. Before we get into the meat of the poll, if you're on the Twitter machine or in the Twitter sphere or whatever we want to call it, we are at John Locke NC here at the John Locke Foundation. I personally am at Donald Bryson. I got very creative with my Twitter handle. Signal Polling, who conducted the poll, is at Signal, but it's CYGNAL. And when we do this poll, it is the Civitas poll. Civitas is a name obviously from the Civitas Institute, but also it's a Latin term which talks about the voting populace in a republic. And that's what this poll is all about, is what does the voting populace think about the issues of the day. So if you'd like to follow along and live tweet our poll presentation, we would really appreciate it. And there are all the tags that you can handle. All right, let's look into the electoral environment here in North Carolina. The first thing we ask is, what do people think about the direction of the country? Are we headed in the right direction, or are we headed in the wrong direction? And you can see, generally speaking, there is deep dissatisfaction with the direction of the country, with 63% of people saying that the country is headed off on the wrong track, 31% saying that it's headed in the right direction. This is a trend that we've been seeing all year, actually dating back into 2020, with the majority of voters being very, very pessimistic about what's going on in the country. Both men and women and voters of all age brackets share this negative sentiment. 2/3 of unaffiliated voters believe the country is on the wrong track. Only Democrats, black voters, and liberals, and those are self-described liberals, are optimistic, but 1 in 3 of each of those think that the country is headed on the wrong track. So all in all, a lot of pessimism going on about the direction of the country. I also wanted to note, and I meant to say this a little bit ago, if you have questions about the poll going forward, if you're looking at the Facebook live stream, please submit those questions through the comment section. Brooke Medina, our Vice President of Communications, will send those questions over to me, and we'll answer them as they go. Usually I have a guest here with me, and I don't today. We opted to not have a guest commentator today, so it's just me as we go through this poll presentation, and I'm happy to answer any questions as we go along. It'll come along to my phone, which is right here, and I'm happy to field any questions you all have. So and we always start these polls the same way. We talk about right direction, wrong track, and then we move to these generic ballot tests. And I always explain this because I want people to understand. This is a statewide poll. Obviously, when you look at the political makeup and how we elect representatives to either Congress or the General Assembly, those are not statewide districts. And so we put up a generic ballot test. So we ask people, generally speaking, we don't give them a specific candidate, but generally speaking, if you vote for Congress or if you're going to vote for the General Assembly, would you vote for a Republican, or would you vote for a Democrat, or would you vote for someone else? And so now we go to the generic ballot test for the state legislature. And you can see, and this is actually should be eye-popping to a lot of us right here, because I personally, in looking at all the Civitas polls over time, and we've been doing these polls since 2006, I do not recall a time when Republicans had a 7-point lead on the generic ballot. You can see that we have 50% of people saying they would vote for a Republican, of the generic Republican, 43% saying they would vote for the generic Democrat. That 50% is actually due to rounding. It came out to 49.5%, but that's still a very substantial lead for Republicans, higher than anything that I've seen. Back in August when we did our last poll, Republicans had a 4-point lead, which we thought was substantial then for Republicans, and now that's jumped to 7. If we look at the heat map, this gets really interesting because you can see that party loyalty is stronger among Democrats than it is for Republicans. Only 80% of Democrats saying they're going to vote for the Democrat candidate, 13% of Democrats saying that they're going to vote for Republicans, as opposed to only 4% of Republicans saying they're going to vote for Democrats. 92% of Republicans are going to maintain their party loyalty and vote for the Republican candidate in these legislative races. Unaffiliated voters prefer Republican, and this is a big deal because it is the fastest growing voting bloc. If you're looking at in terms of partisan voter registration, unaffiliated voters are growing faster than both Republicans and Democrats and actually outnumber Republicans in North Carolina at this point. Unaffiliated voters favor the Republican candidate by 11%, 52 to 41. Voters with at least some college back Democrats at a similar rate to lower education voters supportive Republicans, and so there's definitely an education gap there. That's not to say leaning one way or the other. It's just that there is a difference in terms of level of education. But only voters in the Raleigh media market. And when we have these heat maps up, you see we have the West, Charlotte, Central, Raleigh, Durham, and the Coast. And these are all based off of television markets and media markets. When we look at the Charlotte media market, isn't just Charlotte. It also includes Gaston County and Iredell County and Union County and all of those surrounding counties. The same thing goes with Raleigh-Durham. That is not just Raleigh and it's not just Durham, but it also includes Chapel Hill, Johnston County, Harnett County, Lee County, and all of those surrounding counties. When we look at the coast, that includes not just the Wilmington television market, it also includes the New Bern and Greenville media market. When we say out west, that includes the Asheville media market as well. And of course, when we say Central specifically, we're talking about the Triad media market being Greensboro, Winston-Salem, and High Point. All right, let's move on. Let's look at the generic ballot for Congress. Lots being debated about Congress right now, particularly with the General Assembly drawing new congressional maps in North Carolina and adding a 14th congressional district in North Carolina. And so what are voters saying if they were going to vote in the 2022 election for Congress? Would they vote for the Republican candidate, Democrat candidate, or someone else? And we see that 50%, basically matching numbers as we saw for the generic legislative ballot, 50% said that they would vote for the Republican candidate, 43% again saying they would vote for the Democrat candidate, 7% saying that they are unsure. Let's move to the heat map on this again. And you can see that unaffiliated voters back a generic congressional Republican by it's actually a wider margin than we saw with the legislative ballot. It's by 14%, 53% to 39%. The party loyalty for Democrats is again interesting, with 11% of Democrats saying that they would vote for the Republican candidate. Now that's a lower crossover than we saw on the generic legislative ballot, but still 11% of a party changing that's substantial. So party loyalty continues to strongly favor Republicans. The gender gap between men and women shows a strong edge toward Republicans. This is typical that we see men favoring Republicans more than women, but you can actually see that women are basically tied here as we look at the gender gap, with 46% of women saying they would vote for a Republican, 45% of women saying they would vote for the Democrat, whereas we have 53% of men and 41 saying they would vote Republican, compared to 41% of men saying they would vote for the Democrat. All right, now we move on to job approval ratings for the president and for the governor. And again, if you'd like to submit questions, we'd really appreciate it. Looks like we have a question from a YouTuber. It says, I'm under the impression that the GOP ignore Hispanic voters like they assume we are all Democrats. Do you agree or disagree with this statement? That's a great question. I think that's actually a really fair question. I think that Republicans generally speaking, have struggled to figure out how to deal with minority voters altogether for a long time, simply because, well, there are a variety of reasons on that. But what I hear all the time is Republicans and conservatives need to figure out how to engage minority voters. Our message really resonates with minority voters. How do we get out and do that? And there's a lot of talk about the need for Republicans and conservatives to get out and talk to minority voters, and then there's very little infrastructure put into it. I think that the left and Democrats have actually put infrastructure in place to have sort of, for lack of a better term, community organizers that talk to different communities of interest around the state, including minority communities. And so these communities have just been engaged more by the left and by the Democrat Party than they have by the GOP. Why the GOP hasn't gone about actually spreading the message, I don't really have an answer for, but I don't think that you're wrong in your sentiment that you may feel ignored. All right, let's talk about President Biden. The question was, do you approve or disapprove of the job that Joe Biden is doing as president? And it's not going well for President Biden. 56% of voters say that they disapprove of the job that he is doing. A majority, right at 50% of people, say that they strongly disapprove, compared to 38% overall saying that they approve, 17% saying that they strongly approve. We've got a heat map on this one as well, and I find these heat maps very, very interesting personally. You say that you can see here on here that men, women, and voters of all ages and across all media markets disapprove of President Biden's job performance. Among unaffiliated voters, his job approval is negative 24%. If you're going to try to win an election in North Carolina, that's not how you do it. A sizable portion of Democrats and African American voters also disapprove. So you have 22% of Democrats there saying that they disapprove, 73% of Democrats saying that they approve of what's going on. And I would say that the momentum is actually against President Biden here on a partisan basis. Obviously, with the unaffiliated voters, it's not going well, but the opposition or disapproval of Republicans is much higher, by 21 points actually, than the approval rating from Democrats. So then we take a look. So after we look at the president, we also take a look at the governor. And we ask people, do you approve or disapprove of the job that Roy Cooper is doing as governor? And this is absolutely fascinating. We saw back in August that Governor Cooper was essentially tied in his approval rating. And again, we see it essentially tied here. If you want to look at the actual the numbers and the crosstabs and all that, by the way, this poll is currently online on the John Locke Foundation website. You can go to johnlocke.org. There's a little tab at the top that says polls. You can see this poll with all the crosstabs anytime that you want. Also, you can view all of our previous polls. That's open and free to the public to take a look, and we hope that you find it interesting, and we hope that you find it informative. But this disapproval rating for President or for Governor Cooper is actually the lowest approval rating that we've seen from him in quite some time. Might be and it is probably the highest disapproval rating that we've seen from him. He's technically slightly underwater. Statistically, it's within the margin of error, and so statistically it's a tie, but it's not going well for him, and he is trending in the wrong direction, albeit at a slower rate in the wrong direction than President Biden is. Let's take a look at this heat map. Governor Cooper has a net plus 5% approval rating with women compared to President Biden's negative 15% with women. So he's doing overall better than President Biden and doing overall better with women specifically, but that's still not headed in the right direction. Joe Biden is just remarkably underwater at this point. Unaffiliated voters are split evenly on the governor's job performance, and nearly 1 in 4 black voters disapprove of the way Cooper is doing in his job as governor. Our next little bit, we're going to move on to the economy, but I got one question I want to take a look at real quick, and this has to do with President Biden's approval rating. The question is, where was President Trump at this point in his presidency? And that's very interesting, and it's one I actually prepped for yesterday because I thought I would get this. We see that Joe Biden is remarkably underwater at 38% approve, 56% disapprove. At this point in his presidency, so that would have been October of 2017, Donald Trump was at 45% approve and 50% disapprove. So underwater, absolutely, but not by 18%. Actually, for all 4 years of his presidency, Donald Trump was very close to the margin of error of being a 50-50 president. He was never remarkably popular. He was never remarkably unpopular. It was pretty even keel, very close to 50-50. But we never saw anything like this during the Trump administration. He never had disapproval ratings this high or approval ratings this low. Looks like I got one more question from Clark Pope on Facebook. Trump was hit hard on COVID. Given more have died now under Biden, is that realization showing up in poll numbers? We didn't ask necessarily about the COVID-19 pandemic as it relates to public health, so I don't know that. But put a pin in that question, because we do ask people about the state of the economy, which is definitely tied to the COVID-19 pandemic, and we're just about to get into that. So let's talk about the state of the economy. Now, we already know from earlier, we asked people if they thought the country was on the wrong track or headed in the right direction. People were very pessimistic, so it should be no surprise that voters are pretty sour on the direction of the U.S. economy. We asked overall, do you think the economy is getting better or worse? And we have 63% saying that it's getting worse, compared to just 30% who say that it's getting better. And so that's not really a place that anybody should want voters to be. We would like voters to be very much more optimistic about what's going on in the economy. So let's take a look at this heat map and see where voters are and what they're thinking. 35% of Democrats and black voters think that the economy is getting worse. And so if you're taking a look at what party is in power in Washington, controls both chambers of Congress along with the White House, that would be Democrats, but more than a third of registered Democrats in North Carolina, or likely voting Democrats in North Carolina, think that the economy is trending worse. Nearly 2/3, and that's a big number at 63%, nearly 2/3 of unaffiliated voters think that the economy is getting worse. That's, again, not a way to win elections in North Carolina. Voters of all income levels are pessimistic about the direction of the economy, and you can see how we have levels of income broken out at under 50,000, 50 to 100,000, or over 100,000, and that's fairly uniform. The highest approval, or the highest getting better number that we have there is 32%, which would be for basically all people making 50,000 and up per year. But that's just less than 1/3 of voters in those income brackets. All right, who's responsible for the state of the economy? And we don't make any, in the question you'll see in just a second, we don't make any sort of, we don't make any statements about what the state of the economy is, but we ask the question, which president do you think is more responsible for the current state of the American economy? 29% say that it was President Donald Trump. 55% say that it's President Joe Biden. 11% say neither. 4% are unsure. I think the key takeaway from this question in particular, and I was actually really surprised to see this, but the key takeaway is that it is Joe Biden's economy at this point, period. 29% still think that it's President Donald Trump, but as you'll see in just a second, there's a partisan bent to that. And we'll take a look at that heat map. 32% of Democrats say that it is Joe Biden's economy, compared to 47% who say that it belongs to President Donald Trump. But outside of that, it's really hard to see that how any recognizable or any significant number of voters give that to President Donald Trump. If you look at the gender gap, you have 53% of women say Joe Biden, 59% of men say Joe Biden, 52% of 18 to 34-year-olds, which is significant because we hear both political parties still trying to turn out younger voters in every election cycle. But then as you start to get those older voters in there, you have 60% of 50 to 64-year-olds, which is a very active voting group. And even if you look at this geographically, it's really fascinating. The Raleigh-Durham media market, which in these polls tends to be more liberal than the other media markets around the state, 53% of voters in this media market say that it is Joe Biden who is responsible for the state of the economy. 58% in Charlotte and west of Charlotte, 57% in the Triad, 58% out on the coast. And so resoundingly, I believe we can say that it's Joe Biden's economy. So just to make sure, we asked people, do you approve or disapprove of the way Joe Biden or President Biden is handling issues related to jobs and the economy? 57% disapprove of his handling of the economy, 35% approve. And again, we don't have a heat map on this one, but outside of Democrats and self-described liberals, nearly all groups of voters disapprove of President Biden's handling of the economy. Voters are just incredibly sour on where the economy is right now. But we asked the same question about the governor. And this is also pretty fascinating because we asked, do you approve or disapprove of the way Governor Roy Cooper is handling the economy? And while he is not quite as underwater on this particular question as we saw with President Biden, he is in fact underwater. And we've never really seen Roy Cooper be completely underwater overall in his approval rating. He's slightly underwater, as I said, this month, but less than a point. But we've seen him be underwater on specific issues. If you would look back at our poll from March of this year, I believe it was March of this year, he was underwater on the issue of school reopening, on his job approval rating of getting kids back in schools. But when you look at specific issues like jobs and the economy, he is in fact underwater on this, with 45% saying they disapprove, 40% saying that they approve. And we do have a heat map on this because it's absolutely fascinating, I think. Women are essentially dead even on this, and so males are breaking much harder on the disapprove of Governor Cooper. I keep wanting to say President Cooper, which might upset some people. I don't mean to say that. But males are breaking much harder than females on the disapproval of Governor Cooper's handling of jobs and the economy. Take a look at unaffiliated voters there. Again, a very fast and very large voting block. 46% say they disapprove, 40% saying that they approve of his handling of the economy. Obviously, Republicans are going to be unhappy with a Democrat governor. Democrats are going to be happy with a Democrat governor. But even then, the enthusiasm is towards approval in terms of a partisan basis, with 78% of Republicans disapproving compared to only 66% of Democrats. 18% of Democrats disapprove, and a strong number of unaffiliated, as we've already covered, also disapprove. All right, check and see if we got more questions in. No more questions right now, but if you're watching the live stream on YouTube or if you're watching the live stream on Facebook, please submit your questions, and we'll try to handle them as they come along. All right. Now, we did ask also about the COVID economy and where we are. We asked the question, how long do you think it will take until the economy has recovered all the ground lost during the COVID-19 pandemic? And unfortunately, we have a majority of voters at 53% saying that it will take more than 2 years, 25% saying that it will take between 1 and 2 years, 9% about another year, 2% less than a year, and 1% saying that it's already recovered. Of course, that 1% those 1% and 2% numbers don't even meet the margin of error. But at this point, if you put the between 1 and 2 years and more than 2 years together, you've got 78% of voters who think it's going to take at least a year, if not more, for the economy to recover. And I think that says something about how pessimistic voters are right now on the economy, as we've covered, I think, ad nauseum. If you want to know more and talk more about the economy, by the way, we do lots of online events here at the John Locke Foundation. We do a Shaftesbury presentation every Monday. If you're wondering where that name came from, we are the John Locke Foundation, and John Locke was an English political philosopher who helped write the original charter and constitution for the colony of Carolina. But he had a benefactor who was the Earl of Shaftesbury. And so we have the Shaftesbury Society, and we talk about issues of policy and politics every Monday, and you can see it on Facebook Live and on YouTube. Our Shaftesbury on next Monday at noon will be on rising inflation, labor shortages, and empty shelves. And the panel, it's actually a really great panel, will be Paige Terryberry, who's a fiscal policy analyst here at the John Locke Foundation, Dr. Mike Waldron, who is Professor Emeritus of Economics at North Carolina State University, and Scott Lincecum, who's a Senior Fellow in Economic Studies at the Cato Institute. And they'll be joining Donna Martinez here, who's our host on every Monday at the Shafterbury Society presentation. So please join us on Monday. That'll be October 25th. If you'd like to know more about it, you can go to the events page at johnlocke.org. All right. Let's talk about capitalism and socialism, and what does the public think about capitalism and socialism? We asked the question, do you have a favorable or unfavorable opinion of capitalism? We have 61% of voters saying that they have a favorable opinion, 43% saying that they are very favorable, 26% saying they have an unfavorable opinion. I think a lot of people, at least who are fiscally conservative, would be very excited about these numbers. I'm actually disheartened by these numbers, where less than 2/3 of people have a positive view of capitalism, and more than a quarter of people have an unfavorable view of capitalism. Where do these numbers break down on the heat map exactly? Well, we have nearly 7 in 10 unaffiliated voters have a favorable opinion of capitalism. But if you look at where the highest unfavorable numbers on capitalism are, you have 34% of Democrats, 51% of self-described liberals, and 38% of 18 to 34-year-olds who say that they have unfavorable views of capitalism. Now, admittedly, there's still a majority of 18 to 34-year-olds that are favorable, but we've got 38% of sort of the next generation of leaders of the country who have an unfavorable view of capitalism. And as someone who is a free marketeer, that is a concerning number. But then we asked the reverse question regarding socialism. Based on what you currently know, would you support or oppose the United States would you support or oppose the United States political and economic system becoming more socialist? We have 25% saying that they would support it, 61%, thank goodness, saying that they would oppose it, 8% saying neither, 6% being unsure. And as you can see on the screen, all education and income groups hold strongly negative views of socialism, but we still have a quarter of the country which matches closely with the negative views of capitalism. We still have a quarter of likely voters in North Carolina who said they would support becoming more socialist. Socialism finds the most support among 41% of 18 to 34-year-olds, 35% of 35 to 49-year-olds, 45% of Democrats, and 64% of liberals. Let's pause on that moment for just a little bit. 64% of liberals, of self-described liberals. Actually, let's not pause there. Let's just put a pin in that, and I want to return to that in just a second. So we asked sort of the educated question on socialism. We provided more detail on what that means. And we asked, as you may know, socialism is a political and economic system in which the government assumes control of much of private industry, including things like healthcare, education, banking, manufacturing, and energy production. Socialist countries aim to provide their citizens with basic services at the cost of significantly higher tax rates. Now, knowing this information, would you support or oppose the United States political and economic system becoming more socialist? The numbers are still very close, with 28% actually going up in support, 64% saying they oppose, 6% saying neither, 2% unsure. You're having more people actually come out of that neither or unsure category from the previous question. But when we look at that, what we saw in the previous question, with 64% of liberals and 45% of Democrats saying that they support socialism, I think that we can honestly say that the issue of capitalism versus socialism, or a market economy versus a command economy, has now become, it's a societal issue. It is a cultural issue that we're going to have to deal with as a country at some point or another. It's no longer a question of just public policy. It's a question of what are our values in terms of what our economic and political system needs to look like. And so I think oftentimes when we talk about cultural issues, we talk about kind of what have been termed as social issues, or, regarding abortion and marriage, religion, and that sort of thing. But I honestly believe that capitalism and socialism, and that debate is going to be, and probably currently is, the big societal struggle that we're going to have over the next decade. All right, let's talk about the state budget a little bit. And I don't know if you saw this or not. But there's a story, it came out last night in the News and Observer. Bigger raises, no Medicaid expansion. Raises, but no Medicaid expansion. And latest GOP offer to governor. I feel like Rush Limbaugh with my stack of stuff here. But that's about what's going on about the latest negotiations with the state budget. The state budget, we have not had a new state budget since 2018. The state runs on a fiscal year, so the fiscal year runs out June 30th of every year. Since 2018, and Republicans lost their supermajorities in the General Assembly, they've not been able to come to an agreement with the governor, so the Republican majorities in the General Assembly have sent budgets to Governor Cooper, who's a Democrat. He has vetoed those budgets, and then Republicans have failed to garner enough votes to override those vetoes, and so we've not had a new state budget. We've had many budgets that increase or change funding in specific parts of government, but not an overall comprehensive state budget since 2017 was the last time we passed a comprehensive state budget. And so we asked voters, are they even aware that that's going on, since we have an ongoing continuing resolution in North Carolina, so we don't have the government shutdowns that they have at the federal level because we're more fiscally responsible than the federal government is. But we asked people the question. The deadline for the state government to pass a new budget passed on June 30th. Since then, lawmakers in Raleigh have been in a stalemate on passing a new budget. Which of the following options best describes your level of awareness about the government? The number actually surprised our pollster, Brock McCleary with Signal. He was surprised that so many people were aware of the budget stalemate, at 66% saying they were aware, 30% saying they were not aware, and 3% are unsure. But I would actually point out that we are polling likely voters, and we're polling people who are saying that they are likely to vote next year in 2022, but they're saying it in October of 2021. So these are very engaged voters as it is. So people know what's going on, and Republicans and Democrats are following along the news at a similar clip, at 71% for Republicans, 68% of Democrats. But then we ask this question. I think this is a fascinating question. Has your life been directly impacted due to the lack of a new state budget? I think that in this political bubble, particularly here in Raleigh, but just in the bubble of politics, it's easy to think that the whole world revolves around what's going on down on Jones Street in Raleigh at the General Assembly, and even over on Blunt Street at the Governor's Mansion. But you can see here a clear majority of people at 50% say no, they've not been directly impacted by not having a new state budget. 28% say yes, they have been. Obviously we don't know what their situation is, but then nearly a quarter at 22% say they don't even know if they've been directly impacted by not having a new state budget. And this sentiment's pretty true, that half of all voters say that the budget delays doesn't impact their life. It holds pretty true across all demographic groups. No more than 35% of any electoral group reports that the delayed budget has impacted them directly. All right, let's check and see if I have any questions just yet. Do I have any more? Oh, from Donna Martinez here at the John Locke Foundation. Since so many say it will be 1 to 2 years to recover in the economy, how might that impact Biden campaigning or not campaigning for the midterms? That's actually a great question. I said I would take questions as they come, but that's such a loaded question. I'm going to hold that one to the end, and I'll revisit that. But I have some very definite thoughts about that. But the idea of critical race theory and what's going on in the classroom has been pervasive over the past several months. And so we asked a series of questions about politics in the classroom and what voters thought about that. We asked this question: in your opinion, has classroom instruction in your local K-12 public school become more or less political in the last 5 years? And let's take a look at the heat map on that. Well, I'm sorry, you can see that 75% say it's become more political, 3% less political, 10% say the same, and 12% are unsure. Overwhelming at 75%. You can see here on the heat map how that breaks down. Those numbers on that less political line are very, very dim. 3/4 of respondents believe that classroom instruction has become more political in the last 5 years. 57%, which is a clear majority, actually said much more political as opposed to somewhat more political. Sentiment is especially strong across among voters that are on the ages of 50 to 64, and you can also see that on the coast. Republicans and conservatives and middle and high income earners also are very strong on those sentiments. 3 in 4 unaffiliated voters, so 74%, as you can see there on the heat map, say that politics is making its way into the classroom. There, over on the last column, all the way to the right, we have parents. And what do parents think? 72% of parents say it's become more political. A clear majority at 54% say that not only is it more political, but it's much more political. And that's of concern and should be of concern, I think, for everybody. They passed this instruction non-discrimination bill down at the General Assembly a few weeks ago. Governor Cooper vetoed it. He's called it a critical race theory, or an anti-critical race theory bill, said that critical race theory is not really a thing, and then vetoed the bill. I think he had like a one-sentence explanation. But let's take a look at this heat map and follow along with me, if you will. I think that that is an inadequate explanation and an inadequate prescription for what's going on. When you have 3/4 of voters who believe that instruction in the public classroom has become more political, you can't just wave that off as just some Fox News conspiracy and say that it's not real. Even if it is not real, even if it has not become more political, even if critical race theory isn't a thing, and by the way, I very much believe it's a thing, and our Dr. Terry Stoops here at the John Locke Foundation, who heads up the Center for Effective Education, has written a great primer on critical race theory. You can find it on our website. If you go, again, to johnlocke.org and click on research, you can read that. He's done very well about where critical race theory came from, what are its tenets, and where is it going. Even if you think that critical race theory isn't a thing, public education in North Carolina has a perception problem. And I think, even if the governor says that critical race theory isn't a thing and this anti-discrimination bill wouldn't do anything, he should at least act like he's trying to do something. And the fact that he handled it in that way, and the fact that the education establishment is waving it off and that it doesn't exist, I think is just woefully inadequate to the sentiment that we're seeing from the electorate right now. All right, let's talk about school boards a little bit. We asked the question, students are often given the grades A, B, C, D, or fail, F, to denote the quality of their work. If the school board were graded in the same way, what grade would you give them for addressing parental concerns about politicization in the classroom? A plurality of voters would give school boards a failing grade at 36%. Only Democrats, black voters, liberals, and self-described moderates are split between C and fail, which, by the way, C is not great. I understand that some people say that C is for degree, but that's not going to get you a very high GPA right there. No group awards an A or B with any noteworthy percentage. Bs are at 7%, As are at 3%, which again does not even meet the threshold of the margin of error on this poll, which is at 4.0%. Then we asked the question, and using that same grading scale, what grade would you give the school board for addressing parental concerns about masks and COVID-19 vaccinations? Very similar numbers here in terms of fail at 36% at 35% compared to the 36% we had on the previous slide. Again, most voters give school boards a failing grade, or not most voters, a plurality, a strong plurality of voters give school boards a failing grade, though the overall grading is a bit more positive than on the last. Nearly 1/4 would give an A or a B here. Parents are particularly divided. 38% would give a fail, 34% would give an A or B. Finally, and this is the last question on the poll, so get your questions in if you have them. According to the state test scores released in September, proficiency rates on most state English, math, and science tests plummeted in 2021. Which of the following options comes closest to your personal opinion on how the state should address this learning loss? At 21%, 21% said that families should receive a voucher towards contracting a private tutoring service or an off-duty teacher. 38% say that schools should provide tutoring programs before and after school. Sorry, I'm catching up on the slides on my notes here myself. 18% that schools should offer voluntary summer learning programs. 3% said nothing needs to be done. Students will catch up without additional assistance. I think that's very optimistic. 4% says nothing needs to be done. Learning loss is a myth based on faulty standardized test data. And 16% are undecided. Obviously, we see that a plurality of respondents feel that schools should provide tutoring programs before and after school to combat learning loss. Families receiving vouchers for private tutoring and voluntary summer reading programs come in second preferred options. This preference for school-led tutoring programs holds across all voter groups on this poll, which is, I think, fascinating. Younger voters, so 18 to 34-year-olds, Republicans, conservatives, and parents also show significant support for receiving a voucher to go towards private tutoring. But when you look at parents, the ones who should who will actually be making these decisions, 34% support school-provided tutoring programs, 24% support a voucher for private tutoring, and 19% support voluntary summer learning programs. What you should get from all three of those numbers is that a vast majority of parents think that something needs to be done, and they very much disagree that nothing needs to be done. All right, I said that was the last question. I was wrong. That was the next to last question. There is, in fact, one more question. We asked, most states, including North Carolina, do not require that students take a civics exam in order to graduate high school. Would you support or oppose North Carolina public schools establishing a requirement that high school seniors must pass the U.S. citizenship test as a condition for graduation? 67% of voters support requiring that high school seniors pass the citizenship test in order to graduate. And that sentiment is strong. 47% indicate that they strongly support the requirement. This is most popular with men. I don't think there's any surprise on how that would break down, particularly with how men tend to gravitate on questions like this in North Carolina. Voters that were 75 plus, and voters 75 plus probably actually had a class when they were in high school called civics. You don't have that anymore in public high school. Republicans, conservatives, and high-income voters this was also popular with. It was least popular among voters 35 to 49, Democrats, liberals, and black voters. But parents support the requirement, but are slightly less enthusiastic than the top line number. All right, that was a lot of talking, but you're going to hear from me a little bit more. We got some Q&A. I'm going to revisit this question from Donna Martinez, and we'll go back to the Biden approval numbers earlier in the poll, if I can get there faster. All right, Donna Martinez says, since so many say that it will be 1 to 2 years to recover from the COVID economy, how might that impact Biden campaigning or not campaigning for the midterms? I think it will definitely impact how they campaign for the midterms. I don't think the economic issue is one that can readily be ignored. It's at top of mind in a variety of ways. People are paying higher gas prices. There are emptier shelves on the grocery store. There's slower service everywhere they go. People are seeing that there are definite problems in the economy, and it can't really be ignored. My thought process is that this puts additional pressure on Democrats in Washington to actually pass an infrastructure bill and a budget. Neither of which of those proposals that I've seen from D.C. I personally would support, being on the more conservative side of economics. But I think that they being Democrats in Washington, will feel an absolute need to do something and show some sort of action. Because there's frustration from voters on 2 points. One, the economy is worsening, and they clearly hold Joe Biden responsible for it. He is more tied to it than Donald Trump is. You can't say this is Donald Trump's economy, and I'm just trying to deal with it. Just over a quarter of voters say that Trump is more tied to the economy than Biden is. A clear majority say that Biden is tied to the economy. However, there's frustration from voters on that with how the economy is acting. And then there's also frustration from voters that they haven't been able to do anything on their agenda. Remember, Democrats have majorities in both the Senate because they have the tiebreaker vote with Kamala Harris, and they have a very clear majority in the U.S. House, and they have not been able to push very much of their agenda through in order to do anything with the economy. Now, obviously, I think that most of what they want to do will make the economy worse, but voters haven't seen any sort of action, and there is definite frustration from that side. And you can see that when you take a look at Biden's approval ratings, when you look at the approval ratings when you look at opinions from Democrats on the direction of the economy, You have 35% of Democrats or more than Democrats say that the economy is getting worse. When you look at who Democrats say is more responsible for the economy, about a third again of Democrats say that is Joe Biden. Again, nearly half of Democrats say Donald Trump, but the fact that a third of them tie it to Biden should be troubling and shows levels of frustration. And that's even trickling down to when we look at Roy Cooper, and nearly 20%, 18% of Democrats oppose or disapprove of how the governor is handling the economy. And obviously, the governor has a much smaller toolbox than the president does on the direction of the overall economy. And so I think, to get back to Donna's original question, I think that the campaigning is going to come down to what can they get done. If they can't get anything done, I think it will bode worse for Democrats. Like if there was just no activity and they don't pass anything, it will be worse. But all of these numbers that we're seeing, from approval ratings in the economy, overall approval, disapproval ratings for Joe Biden, and then what we saw with Republican leads on the generic ballot, keep in mind, all of those numbers are trending in the direction of Republicans right now and in favor of Republicans right now before any Republican or Republican pressure group or conservative pressure group has run the first ad or dropped the first piece of mail. This is just people living life and watching the news. And that's bad news for Democrats right now. Got a question on our polling sample. Do you guys poll Republicans about the legislative branch in North Carolina too? Yes, Republicans are part of the overall voter turnout. And so we do, we poll everybody. Our polling sample is based off of the likely 2022 turnout. And so actually, let me get to the last slide. If you want to see who all we poll or the demographics of how we polled, sorry, it's a lot of slides to get through. There we go. The slide's up now. In terms of a partisanship breakdown for this poll, and again, it's a sample size of 600, done by Signal Polling. In terms of partisan registration, 32% of those polled were Republican, 37% polled were Democrat, 26% polled were unaffiliated, 4% were another party, and 2% were unsure. 55% of the poll was female, 45% male. And so that's essentially a breakdown of who we polled for this poll, and that's relatively close to what the likely voter turnout will be in the 2022 elections. All right, we've got one more question from Randy. Don't know Randy's name, but he asked, what do you think about Congressman Price's retirement announcement mean for the electoral landscape in North Carolina going into 2022? That is a great question, and I don't know just yet. What I've read and heard from a few people is that there will probably be several Democrats vying for that seat. He's controlled that seat for about 20 years now. Congressman Price has been in and out of Congress since the early 1990s, believe it or not, which, if that's not an argument for term limits, I don't know what is. But suddenly the seat pops open, and I think there's going to be a lot of competition among Democrats for that seat. But that seat is probably going to be based around the Raleigh and Durham kind of urban areas, which are trending more and more blue over time. Does that affect the overall electoral map? Maybe not. Obviously, they're redrawing maps right now at the General Assembly, but it's not going to surprise me if the district that replaces the current 4th district in North Carolina, it's not going to surprise me if that is also a solid Democrat seat. We'll see. But that just has to do with the fact that Democrats are generally packing themselves into urban areas, and that's just the fact of the matter. All right, do we have any more questions? All right, no more questions right now. We're just shy of our typical 1 hour, but usually there's more conversation because we have a guest commentator. Opted not to do that. We're trying some new things. We changed up the slide presentation, went without a commentator this month, and that's okay. If you do have questions about the poll or methodology, you're always free to submit them online. You can also email me at dbryson@lockhq.org. Again, that's lock with an E. If you want to look at the poll yourself, look at the breakdown, look at the crosstabs, look at the top lines, whatever you want, you can go to johnlocke.org and click on polls, and you can see not only this poll, but all the polls that we've done. We'll do another poll. I believe we're looking at November 17th or November 18th to release that next one. It's not in the field yet. Haven't even written it yet, but you'll see some advertisements about that poll presentation coming up soon. Look forward to hearing any responses that you all have. Thank you for joining us today, and share this with your friends. Talk to you soon.